This video is brought to you by PrizePicks. So we talked about some of the fallout from the Myles Garrett trade. And certainly part of that fallout is there's going to be a lot of pressure on Jared Verse, right? We did a film breakdown on Jared, and I feel bad for Jared in a way, because he did not do anything to put himself in this place to be constantly compared to one of the greatest of all time, right? It's kind of like being the running back that replaced Jim Brown. Nobody wants to be that guy, right? But that's the situation that Jared Verse finds himself in. And look, I know he's a competitor. I know he's a top-tier athlete. He's going to look at this as a challenge that he hopes to accept. But, we as observers can look at that challenge and see how unfair that is to anybody, you know what I mean? And how tough of a spot that is. So when you think of the burden that somebody's going to have to carry because Myles is gone, don't think of it as just Jared Verse's burden that he has to carry. This is a burden that's going to have to be carried by eventually the entire defense. And the reality is that you're not going to be a better defense without Myles Garrett than you were with Myles Garrett, right? Like, that's just not going to happen. You can't lose a player like that and expect to be better. You can only lose a player like that and hope that you don't get that much worse or significantly worse. And I think part of us coping with the Myles Garrett trade is just accepting that reality. You're not winning a Myles Garrett trade, but you can come out of it where you're not too damaged, But back to my point about who the pressure is on, right? Instantly, people are going to look at Jared Verse and hope that he carries the mantle for Brown's edge rushers. And maybe Jared's capable of doing this. I will say this, Jared is the second most talented edge rusher this franchise has had. It's just unfortunate he's replacing the number one guy. But if you look at guys that have come to Cleveland at that edge rusher position, there's Myles Garrett and then there's Jared Verse. So that's what Jared does have going for himself. But see, this mantle isn't just for Jared Verse to carry, because a huge part of the reason that the Browns felt comfortable trading Myles Garrett, it's not just because of Jared Verse. Obviously, guys like Carson Schlesinger are a part of that calculation, Emmanuel McNeil-Warren, who they hope to have him develop into a good piece, things like that, the young core of this team, sure. But the Browns spent the number 5 overall pick on another defensive lineman in Mason Graham. And I think Mason Graham is the guy who needs to become the quote-unquote big winner of this trade. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second, but first I got to thank my sponsor, PrizePicks. PrizePicks is a fun way to earn cash while you watch your favorite teams. No complex betting rules, just pick more or less on a few player stats and lock in your lineup. Here are my picks for this upcoming season, AFC North edition. Jimmy Bernard, I have less than 475. This has to do with volume available in Pittsburgh's offense. Quincy Judkins, I have over 975. Browns improved line. I think the run game's going to be better with it. Chase Brown, under 900 yards. Joe Burrow equals less rushing yards usually for the Bengals offense. Mark Andrews, more than 475 yards. Lamar's going to need a safety blanket. Check to see if PrizePicks is available in your state. You could follow me on the app at Quinn_C to see all my lineups. Download the PrizePicks app today. Play $5 and get $50 in lineup to download the app using the link in the description. See, Jared Verse is not going to be able to make up for the gap between him and Myles Garrett in 1 year. Even if Jared Verse takes a leap, right, and he goes from being a Pro Bowl caliber player to a Max Crosby level guy, there's still going to be a significant gap between what he's able to produce and what Myles is able to produce, right? Like if Jared Verse comes in here and he gets 14 sacks, well, Myles had like 24 last year, right? Like he's still 10 under a whole season under Myles. There's a huge gap between those two players. But who can help make up that difference is Mason Graham. And that's really who I think once the season starts, the pressure is going to be on to step up is Mason Graham. Now, I've talked about this before. I think Mason Graham is going to be in line for a strong year 2. One, he's older, he's stronger. This is a position that takes a little longer to get better at than most, right? Because you're dealing with guys in the trenches, and guys in the trenches are really strong, really powerful. It takes a while to build up to NFL level strength, right? That's just a part of the game that we've acknowledged for years along the line of scrimmage. It takes these guys just a little bit longer than other positions, especially skill positions. But the other reason is from what Mason Graham has demonstrated. If you watch my video on 3 Browns who I think can redeem themselves or take a leap, you would see that Mike Hall is somebody I think that they can get a lot more out of, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But if you've also watched my video about why you should be more excited about Mason Graham, and I think you should revisit that video now more than ever, what Mason was able to do from the bye week to before he broke his ribs was elite level stuff. We're talking about a guy who had a pass rush win rate of like 27% on TPS, which is like almost Myles Garrett level. See, if Mason Graham takes a leap and Jared Verse takes a leap at the same time, the Browns defensive line can still be very, very high level. There's also some other players, now that Myles isn't there to monetize or monopolize the sack production, might have more room to eat, right? Promising players like Alex Wright and Isaiah McGuire, who have had to fight for room in a crowded edge rush rotation that was always going to center Myles Garrett, now find themselves with more room to grow into more different roles there, right? So you have that growth that you're expecting from those players, and then Mason Graham, and then you get somebody like a Mike Hall who's at a precarious spot so far in his development. See, Mike Hall has been good when he's out there. I think he had a pass rush win rate his rookie year about 17.9%, which is impressive, right? But unfortunately for Mike Hall, due to reasons that are his own fault, right? His domestic violence situation that took him out for his rookie training camp, and then reasons that weren't really his fault, the injury that took him out for basically a calendar year, and really slowed his growth last year. He's had a slow start to his career. And I think he's somebody who's going to be in a position to be successful and to step up and make up for some of that production. They're going to have to do it as a committee. They're going to have to do this as a committee. But there is hope that you could replicate most of what you got when you had Myles Garrett on this team with what you have right now, right? You're never going to be able to replicate the full Myles Garrett experience because part of the Myles Garrett experience is just unique to Myles Garrett, right? Myles Garrett is a generational talent. He's somebody who quarterbacks legitimately fear. We've heard Lamar Jackson talk about there's only one quarterback I'm worried about when it comes to edge rusher I'm worried about when it comes to RPOs, and it's Myles Garrett. We know that, quarterbacks play differently when they see 95 on that other side. And that changes what they might want to do, right? And quarterbacks might be more willing to try shit that they would have never tried when Myles Garrett is out there, now that Myles Garrett is not out there. We're going to see that, right? You're going to see a decline because of some of that stuff. You don't have the mental edge of having one of the greatest players of all time out there for your defense, and that's certainly going to hurt. But if we're just talking about numbers, we're just talking about production, there is a pathway for the Cleveland Browns to replicate some of the numerical production that they have there. Think of it like this. For a while, Pittsburgh was able to outproduce and produce better defenses than the Cleveland Browns early in Myles' career. Not because TJ Watt was a better player than Myles at that point, but because they had a better overall defensive line than what Myles had at that point, right? Myles Garrett didn't have a Cam Hayward to help him out. Well, if you're looking at Jared Verse, you look at the defensive tackles he's played with, yeah, he's had some good players next to him or decent players next to him. But Mason Graham should be an upgrade from what he's had on the interior before, right? The Browns defensive line in total and the Browns defense is probably one of the better supporting casts he's played with. So you should see an upgrade in Jared Verse's play from that. One of the hopes I think the Browns have is that you're going to see an uptick in Jared Verse's sack production because he's going to turn a lot of those pressures, which he can get at a high rate, to plays he can finish because there's going to be other guys getting pressures that are going to make it easier for him to finish plays. Mason Graham lived this life last year where he had 1 sack, but if you look at his production, his tape, he was playing on the level of somebody who would have about 8 sacks traditionally, right? He didn't get that number because Myles Garrett just, again, monopolized the sack production on his team, especially towards the end of the season once that sack record became in reach. Now, no Myles Garrett, a lot of those pressures are still going to be sacks that the Browns get. Now other players get to get those sacks. Last year, the Browns had, I think, about 56 sacks in the entire season, which is not a unreachable number for this crew, right? You want Jared Verse to go from 7.5 to, I think 12 to 13 is a number you're comfortable with for him his first year in Cleveland. You want Mason Graham to get about 8 sacks, maybe even double-digit sacks now that Myles isn't here, right? You want Mike Hall to get about 6 this year, Malik Collins to get about 6 this year. I know he had more or somewhere around that number last year, but you can make up the sack production with the committee that you have because even though Jared Verse isn't Myles Garrett, he's still a number 1 edge. Like if you look at the edges in the division, this is a crazy stat about the Browns here, but the Browns still have the best individual pass rusher in the division, right? They don't have Myles Garrett, who was the best in the universe, but they have Jared Verse, who's arguably better than Herbig, arguably better than anybody that the Ravens have, and arguably definitely better than whoever the Cincinnati Bengals are throwing out there. So, yeah, we don't have Myles Garrett, but Jared Verse can fill that gap. And now the selection of Mason Graham feels really important, right? The Browns getting Mason Graham and being able to draft him. Because if Mason Graham is able to be the elite player he was in the 4 weeks after the bye week, but before he broke his ribs, then that pick is going to save this defensive line. So, yes, a lot of the conversation is going to be on Jared Verse, and rightfully so. Yes, a lot of expectations are going to be on Jared Verse, and rightfully so. The Browns technically value Jared Verse more than they value Mason Graham because they look at Jared Verse as a first-round plus player. So that means a first-round pick plus more, where they only use a first-round pick to get Mason Graham, obviously. So, yes, there's going to be a lot put on the shoulders of Jared Verse. But Mason Graham, being that 5th pick of the draft, being the kind of player that they think can anchor a defensive line, that's also going to be very important. And if Mason Graham can develop into that, and Jared Verse can go from a high single-digit sack guy to a consistent 10 to 12 sack guy in this defense, then now we have something that's not as good as just having Myles Garrett, but it's comparable. And you have the extra first-round pick, and you can hope that that turns into a quarterback and try to figure this whole thing out from there. So, yeah, a lot of eyes are on Jared Verse, but I want to tell you guys, Mason Graham's going to be super important this year. And also, hindsight being 2020, aren't you glad we drafted Mason Graham? I certainly am. And I hope that that works out to its fullest extent because I think Mason Graham can be an elite defensive lineman for this team for a very, very long time. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.